got a red for REC, that's a good sign. I've got a light here, that's a good sign. And I got a light there. All right. And what I try to do is spend some time looking in the camera and also but eye to eye. Are we ready?
Yes.
Oop. Rule number 1, turn your phone off. If you, there we go. And today is the 21st. Good morning, everybody. I'm Larry Williams, and I'm the director of CARMA, the Consortium for the Advancement of Research Methods and Analysis, now hosted administratively at the University of North Dakota. But as you can tell in the fact that we're sitting outside and I'm in my shirt sleeves, we are not in Grand Forks, North Dakota, but instead we are in Athens, Georgia, where we are hosting our first remote webcast. And this afternoon we're going to have 2 great presentations, and as you may know if you've seen some of our other interviews, I like to take advantage of having the distinguished methodologists that are available to do the webcast lecture. I like to take advantage of that opportunity and have a little chat with them that we call our Meet the Methodologist, which is what you're watching. And so we're sitting outside the University Conference Center at the University of Georgia, and I'm really excited to have this opportunity to have some conversations with one of our 2 distinguished presenters, Steve West. You may know Steve is a professor of psychology at Arizona State University. You may know him from his role as editor of Psychological Methods, or you may know that he is also a co-author on the very successful regression book, Cohen, Waken, and Est. So, Wes, Steve?
Thank you.
Thank you. So, Steve, I'm always interested in how it is that people get involved in the professions that they end up with. And so how is it that you went from Cornell to Texas to pursue your graduate studies?
Well, my interest in methodology started when I was at Cornell as an undergraduate, and there was a then young assistant professor, now long retired, named Richard Darlington, who was teaching for the first time my senior year a course that combined methods and statistical analysis. It was a required course for psychology majors. None of us knew what it was about. But what Darlington did in that course was raise problems and offered methods of solving them, and it was really, really exciting. And as an anecdote, about 4 or 5 years after I got my PhD, I met some Cornell undergraduates who were then off as assistant professors at a psychological meeting. And we asked what was the most important class. And everyone first talked about the great lecturers, and then the question was raised, what course changed your life? And to a person, it was Darlington's class.
Okay. So, so you end up at Cornell, at Texas, and you're a grad student in the early 70s. And so what was the training like in your program then? Kind of what were the topics that were seen as cutting edge that you got exposure to in your seminars and in your research activities?
Well, Larry, the situation was very different in the early 70s. I went to University of Texas at Austin, and I had 2 emphases. One was in social psychology, and one was in quantitative psychology. Quantitative psychology then was a combination of statistics, and it was also involved mathematical psychology and computer modeling. So I got exposed to statistics from Quinn McNamara, and I worked with John Lolan on computer simulation, and there are a number of other really, really very, very knowledgeable people there at the time.
Okay, and so as one might gather from somebody who is the former editor of Psychological Methods, you've had an extraordinarily successful and productive career. So What is it that you look back on the training that happened to you at Texas? What were the things that you learned that have helped contribute to your success over the years?
Well, I look back at it as in sort of an odd way. The training I got from Darlington at Cornell and from everyone at Texas laid the foundation. Mm-hmm. And I didn't immediately go into quantitative psychology. I went into social psychology. And my first assistant professor job was at Florida State University. And I think the second or third year I was there, we hired Lee Seacrest. Mm-hmm. And I was doing basic laboratory research in social psychology at that time. And Lee came and held his weekly meetings that he's held his entire career and still holds to this day into his 80s. And we would discuss a variety of topics. For example, the exploratory data analysis work had just been done during that time by John Tukey, and he had published his great book on exploratory data analysis. So we spent a couple weeks on exploratory data analysis and what it offered, and Seacrest reawakened my interest in methodology and got me to change.
Yeah, okay. Well, you mentioned that transition to being a faculty member, and I'm also always curious about what that transition is like for people, because as a graduate student, you think you have some sense of what life is going to be like as a faculty member, but then you find out oftentimes that what you thought was going to be the case is not the case. So, other than those meetings that you were mentioning, what was that transition like for you? What were you well prepared for? What were you not prepared for?
That's an interesting question, and I have in a paper with Leona Aiken and Roger Millsap written about some of the perils of being an assistant professor in methodology, and there are real perils in that. I didn't fully face that because I was still doing basic research as well as methodology, so I got evaluated primarily on my basic research. And people who are methodologists often get asked, well, what do you really do? And what's your substance? And for someone who's really trained in methodology, and that's what they do, it's methodology.
Yeah.
And that's a very, very hard thing to get past in many departments in the tenure process. I got my research together, I got publications, I had some good advocates on the faculty. My teaching, I was well prepared for teaching. I didn't really start working with graduate students until towards the end of my assistant professor years. I think I was not prepared for that, but I learned quickly. And some of the challenges of teaching different kinds of classes I was not prepared for. When I really like teaching psychology graduate students, but sometimes students who are in professional schools can be difficult because they just want to get the credential. I had to teach a course that had all pre-medical students and a special pre-medical program that linked right into the medical school, and it was the worst class I taught in my life, and so those kinds of things are challenges.
Yeah. Well, you manage those challenges well, and as I mentioned, you've had a lot of editorial experience. I mentioned psychological methods, but of course you began as being editor of Journal of Personality, and now you continue that editorial work with multivariate behavioral research. So my question to you is, how is it that as you were moving along in your research career, you then took on those editorial responsibilities, Did they have, did being an editor impact the way that you think about your research or conduct your research? And if so, what was that impact?
Well, I think there are two questions here.
Yep.
One is how
Sorry.
I became an editor. I was a visiting professor at Duke, and at that time, Phil Costanzo was the editor of Journal Personality, and I did several reviews for him, I think a few before I went to Duke and several while I was at Duke. And then when I went back to Florida State, he invited me to become associate editor of Journal Personality, and I did that, and I ultimately became editor of Journal Personality. And I found that I learned a lot from doing that about writing and about organizing articles. And later I transferred that into methodological articles, and I was associate editor for psychological methods and then editor of psychological methods. Mm-hmm. Now remind me of the second part of your question.
Just how has it impacted the way that you look at your research or you conduct your research or your writing?
I think there is an advantage of having been an associate editor or an editor in that you learn much of what is needed to prepare an article. Mm-hmm. So I know I've had discussions with some other people who have not been editors who were really, really fine methodologists, people like David Kenny and Donald Rubin. And in the early days, they didn't know how to do that, and they had a lot of papers rejected. Mm-hmm. Donald Rubin said that his really, really famous original paper on missing data that he published in 1976 was rejected 6 times before Sir David Cox got it as editor and said, look, this is really important, and if you present it in this way, it will likely be accepted. Mm-hmm. And learning those kinds of things, I think, really helps you write your papers and present better arguments and not just have a partially completed piece of work and submit it to a great journal and they say, sorry, we can't take it, but present a more complete piece
So
of work.
from your experience, either substantively with the Journal of Personality or methodologically, are there some common mistakes that you would see over and over again by authors that really worked against their success?
Well, I think there are a couple of things that editors do if they're a good editor. And the first thing that editors have to do, and Larry, I know you have been an editor, and the unpleasant part of the job is you get papers that clearly are not going to make it and you have to reject them. Mm-hmm. And so the first part is the screening process. Now the second part is you get good papers and they have interesting ideas and maybe things aren't developed, or maybe they need more simulation, or maybe they need a proof, or whatever they need, or maybe they need a good example. You tell people that they need that and you help them do it. And I think one of the things I've been able to do as editor is to improve papers. So what do you need for a good paper? You need a good question. Mm-hmm. And if you have a good question, you're probably half the way there. Mm-hmm. And then you have to come up with some good method of solving the question that works in most cases. Yeah. And then organize it and write it and present it clearly. Yeah, I did the interview yesterday with our other presenter this afternoon, Jason Colquitt, and he made the interesting comment that, basically it's that he talked about spending that extra several weeks right before you collect the data where you really push yourself hard, to try to think through everything and make sure that you've done all that you can to maximize the impact. The implication was that a lot of times we're just so anxious to get the papers under review that we fall short of that. I want to switch gears a little bit with you. With my work with Karma, within the area of organizational studies, there
has been the adoption of some of the more advanced techniques and methodologies. But if you talk to the people who are knowledgeable about those, they are concerned that the transfer of knowledge or the adoption of best practices is occurring too slowly. So as the field that has all of these new developments, what do you think we can do to speed up that transfer of knowledge, that adoption, so that we see articles that are published that come closer to meeting all of the standards that the methodologists would advocate?
Well,
I know that's a long question, so feel free to go whatever direction you want with it.
Well, also in the article by Aiken, West, and Millsap, which was an American psychologist a few years ago, we talk about adoption a bit. And the first step seems to be doing the formal work and developing the method, and then it's usually in a very, very technical form. Mm-hmm. So then you have, at some point, a good textbook that comes along and organizes the area, and then you also have to have easy-to-use computer software. Mm-hmm. So when you get all three of those things together, you get the method being developed, and often with the textbooks, there's initially a higher level, great textbook, and it's followed by a lower level, introductory textbook that makes it more accessible to more people. And those are all really important things. In terms of increasing the cutting edge, you need some programs that are actually training people. So at Arizona State University, we have a very good quantitative program now. And one of the benefits of our quantitative program that all of the substantive areas in psychology cite is people who are interested in quantitative, who want to work in the substantive area, come to Arizona State because we have the quantitative program. Mm-hmm. So for those people who are already interested, those kinds of things are very important. For those people who don't have that interest so much, there are a couple of models. The one is to try to get the training somewhere, and there are various kinds of workshops that are available. Karma has a great series of workshops. There are many others as well. The American Psychological Association has a couple workshops, and they're going to move to Arizona State next summer, one on longitudinal and one on big data. Mm-hmm. So those kinds of workshops can be very, very good. The other kind of thing that's, if you think about it, is in psychology and in business, the idea is you do your own work. Mm-hmm. You do your own statistical work. And in medicine, that's not the case at all. Mm-hmm. None of these people do their work. They have a biostatistician. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the really big, complicated projects now have methodologists doing that work, and the substantive people are collaborating with the methodologists, and the methodologists are collaborating with substantive people, and they're both informing each other and making that work better.
Yeah. Okay. So, Steve, I was looking over your Vita, and of course, in addition to the length, one of the things that's particularly impressive to me is the wide range of topics that you are actively involved in. And so I'm going to mention just a couple of those topics. Mm-hmm. And what I'd like for you to do is just offer a comment either on what you think is most understood about the particular topic, or what it is that if you have like 1 minute to tell somebody about what to pay attention to.
Okay.
All right. So the first topic is testing interactions with latent variables.
Okay.
So what's misunderstood, or what do people need to know right now at the end of 2014?
Okay. Let me make a preliminary comment and then
Sure.
ask your question.
You're being a very good sport about this. I appreciate it.
When I was in graduate school, Quinn McNamara wrote a letter for me, and Quinn McNamara at that time was a very, very eminent quantitative psychologist. He had been president of the American Psychological Association, and some of you may have encountered that name through the McNamara test, which is still widely used. And he wrote a letter of recommendation for me in which he said, this young man has potential and he may amount to something if he can ever decide what he wants to be when he grows up. And I guess I still haven't grown up because I still am working in many, many different areas. I'm working in areas that I'm interested in. So your first question was latent variable interactions.
Yeah.
And I think there are a couple. I think the most important thing there that's misunderstood is latent variable interactions buy you something, and that is a much better estimate of the magnitude of your interaction effect if they're properly done. Latent variable interactions can be very sensitive to non-normality, and the product of two normal variables is not normal. So you're always going to have some non-normality, and it's very easy to get a lot of non-normality. So you have to do some corrections for non-normality, and some techniques really break down with non-normality and don't work very well that are the best when you have purely normal data, observed variables. But the big hidden secret of testing for interactions is people hope that they will give you more statistical power, and they don't. They give you less statistical power. And
In testing them with latent variable methods.
testing with latent variable methods. You're creating a variable that doesn't exist, an interaction, and you don't have indicators of it. And doing both of those things, when you do it properly, buys you accuracy of estimate, but buys you a bigger standard error.
Okay.
We've done some work on that, and the piece of published research where that is buried is in a paper by Cham, West, Aiken, I can't remember all the authors, and Ma, I don't remember what order it is. It was in multivariate behavioral research a couple years ago.
All right. How about multi-level mediation? Is there anything that people really are thinking about in the wrong way? Any key thing that they should know about it?
That's a great question, and I don't have a good answer for you on that. I think there's some real issues about what effects mean, and I don't think those have been fully explored. And one of the big issues that's coming up in mediation is causal inference, because we assume in mediation that we're holding everything else constant, and we're not. So even in a randomized experiment where you've randomized your treatments versus control, or whatever the two treatments are, your mediator has not been randomized, and simple things can cause problems. For example, this is just in a single mediator, in the single mediator case, that if you have pretests of your outcome variable and your mediator, and they're correlated with each other at baseline, and then they predict the later value, the post-treatment value of the mediator, that is, the pretest of the mediator predicts the post-test of the mediator, and the pretest of the outcome predicts the post-test of the outcome, which is really common, you're going to get a biased estimate.
Okay.
And so that's what you have in single level, and now you've got two levels involved. And so I think the causal inference issues in multi-level mediation are going to be very, very difficult.
All right, the last topic I'll mention, I mentioned at breakfast this morning, having to do with effects decomposition. and which is something that's been recommended but seems to be increasingly adopted. And so what should people know about doing effect decomposition?
Okay, why don't you define what you mean by effect decomposition?
Just thinking about or computing total effects into direct effects and indirect effects.
Well, both Larry and I are interested in fit of models, and one of the issues that easily occurs in complex models, and this includes both structural equation models that have a measurement component where each of your constructs has multiple indicators, and it also occurs in multi-level structural equation models, is that you have different components that are contributing to your fit. And so if you have a structural equation model with multiple indicators, you can have a very, very good measurement model. That is, if you had no structural paths, but just correlations, it would be a great model. Mm-hmm. But when you put the restrictions on it that represent your path model, your structural model within that full model, the path model is terrible. Mm-hmm. And so if you decompose it into the measurement component and the structural component, you can get a much better indication of what's going on. Mm-hmm. Similarly, in multi-level models, multi-level structural equation models, you can have the fit of a multi-level structural equation model is almost entirely driven by level 1, and you can have a terrible level 2 fit. Mm-hmm. And so Ari Ryu and I have developed some methods of decomposing it into two levels, and Peter Bentler and one of his students, his colleagues have developed another method of doing that. So you can separate it into components and look at the parts that you're interested in particular. And I'd also point out that there are a couple papers by Rod McDonald, one in Psych Methods in 2002, McDonald and Ho, and one, I think, in Psychological Science around 2010, where he really advocated looking at the residuals and see what's going on at that level. So don't just get caught up in the fit of the overall model. Look at the parts and look at the individual residuals. And are there variables that are not being predicted, or are there parts of the model that are not working? And those you need to worry about.
Okay. All right, now I won't put you on the spot so much, a little easier question. Why don't you tell us about your webcast lecture you're going to give this afternoon? Just a quick summary of it.
Okay, I'm going, as Larry has pointed out, I do work in many areas, and one of the areas I work in is the research design and causal inference. And I'm going to talk about alternatives to the randomized experiment, and in particular I'm going to talk about some of the reasons why we need alternatives to the randomized experiment, where randomized experiments can't be implemented or break down. And I'm going to talk about two things. I'm going to talk about one of the designs that's viewed as one of the weakest quasi-experimental designs, what is called in the statistics literature the observational study, and what is called in psychology and education the non-equivalent control group design, where you have a treatment and control condition. You measure your participants before the treatment and after the treatment, and participants are not randomly assigned to treatment and control conditions. So that's generally viewed as a weak design. I'm going to talk about strategies coming from Donald Campbell's perspective on causal inference to strengthen that design. I'm going to talk about strategies from Donald Rubin's perspective on causal inference to strengthen that design. And then what I'm going to do is take a few of those back, and we're going to look at randomized experiments where you have treatment non-compliance. So we always think about a randomized experiment where everyone is getting the treatment who's in the treatment condition and everyone is getting control who's in the control condition. And a classic example is the Canadian mammography trial, where where women who were eligible for getting a screening mammogram were randomly assigned to get a screening mammogram or to get no screening mammogram, and 30% of those assigned to the treatment condition did not get the treatment, even though they made it as convenient as possible at no cost and everything else, and 5% of those in the control condition got the treatment. So how do you deal with problems like that?
Okay. Well, I'm looking forward to it, and I'm sure all of our viewers are as well. The last question, one of the real treats of my gig as Karma director and meeting and hanging out with successful people is just looking at people who are able to sustain that success over a long career. And after they have long accomplished many things that other people will just be satisfied with. So how do you stay motivated? What is it that drives you to continue to be engaged and as active as you are?
I have several things that I do that help me. I believe in lifelong learning. So almost every year, I take at least one and often two courses. I sit those courses. So right now I'm sitting a course on longitudinal data analysis. Not this moment, but this
I can give you a pass to give to your professor if you'd like.
Right. I'm taking from a young colleague, Kevin Grimm, who's teaching a marvelous course. So I've been doing that my entire life, and I've now sat a lot of courses. I've probably taken or sat multiple regression 14 times in various departments: econometrics, statistics, sociology, psychology, you name it. I'm beginning to learn something about it. So that's been good. So that's one thing. A second thing is I have been very blessed at Arizona State University of having great graduate students. And great graduate students keep you motivated. And some of my best teachers have come disguised as graduate students. And that's important to have that stimulation. And I think particularly as you get older, those kinds of things that you want to do change. And I want to think about issues, but I don't want to write a SAS program that's 20 pages long and it doesn't run because I forgot a period, and not be doing that. And graduate students will do that, and they will get excited by it, and they will figure things out, and they will make the work better. So I love that. And the graduate students have been a real stimulus. And I also probably have a secret advantage in that in the early 1980s, I started dating a woman, and we hit it off and ultimately got married, and she's also a quantitative psychologist, and that's Leona Aiken, and she's also been very, very influential in my career and has helped to contribute to some of my best work.
Yeah. Well, I should have mentioned at the beginning that we're really welcoming you back to Karma because you and Leona both came and gave Karma presentations at Virginia Commonwealth. But it's been a real pleasure chatting with you, and I look forward to your conversation or to your lecture this afternoon. And just thanks so much for making the trip from Tempe to Athens to share of your work and share of your perspectives on your career. Thanks so much, Steve.
Thank you, Larry.
All right. That was great, man. That was great. All right. Let's